This was a labour of love putting this panel together, and a lot of work, but it really is paid off with such incredible panellists. Thanks so much for coming tonight. And Shane is going to actually moderate this, so I'm going to let him introduce these panellists. We have two panels tonight, if you're not aware. So the first one is how regulators think about creating new frameworks for the emerging class without stifling innovation. Thanks to Ryan for that. Okay, so there will be included Q&A in these, right?
Yep. We might have a little bit of somewhat of a discussion, and then we can take questions and have a good Q&A after that. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Shane Glenn, as Pemo said, and we're here at a FinTech Silicon Valley event at Shepard Mullen's office in San Francisco. Thank you very much again for hosting us and letting us use your space. So this is panel number one, sort of how to think about regulating cryptocurrency. And starting with my immediate left, we have Carla Kervu with Coinbase.
Wealthfront.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Wow. Can we start over? Sorry, with Wealthfront. Scott Walker with the SEC. Adam Ettinger with Shepard Mullen. And Ryan Selkis with Masari. So I thought we'd kick things off with, if you weren't aware, early this morning, our time, the head of the SEC and the head of the CFTC spoke in front of the Senate Finance panel. And it was a very interesting 2+ hour long discussion. And I'd just like to see if anyone has any comments. Anyone caught it? Only read prepared remarks?
Scott actually wrote the entire part.
Sure. So I don't know if you guys read the 21A report, but kind of embedded within the 21A report was this mention of, if you're a platform, that you should be considering whether or not you should be registered as an exchange or an ATS. And if you listen to the hearing this morning, Chairman Clayton repeatedly talked about gatekeepers and exchanges and these types of, kind of periphery entities. And so I would be betting that since this is on his mind, this is probably where the next enforcement action is going to go.
Start. Before I make any comments, I need to say a disclaimer. I am speaking in a personal capacity tonight, not on behalf of the Commission or the staff of the SEC. I would just like to add that.
Can people hear him in the back?
Yes. You can get the mic.
We got a no. We got a couple of thumbs up.
So I just want to kind of add to that I thought the chair's comments did stress the kind of the delicate and deliberate thought being put through the regulator and the agency with respect to capital formation issues and trying to balance that with investor protection. So trying to serve the kind of multifaceted mandate of the Commission. I don't think it's lost on anyone how efficient of a means of capital formation the auctions and the capital raises have been vis-a-vis the blockchains over the last 18 months.
So I guess I should chime in here since I'm neither a lawyer nor a former or current regulator. But I have been in the industry for a little while, and a little bit of context about Masari. We're basically trying to build an open source Edgar-like data repository for the universe of crypto assets. So what would it be like to reverse engineer a 10K or an S1 for one of these new token offerings? And importantly, how you think about ongoing disclosures and self-regulation in an environment that kind of toes the line between securities and commodities, which is what I think we saw a lot of today. And I think the short answer was Clayton basically came right out and said, these are all securities, all token sales. And he repeated it a couple of times. So I think that probably gives you a little guidance in terms of what the SEC is thinking. And then you had Giancarlo on the other hand, who I think the crypto community wants to elect as our next president, for basically saying that he talks about Bitcoin at the dinner table with his kids, and we should be respectful of what the younger generation is thinking in terms of this new innovation. So definitely a mixed bag, but just so you know where my kind of very foreign perspective is coming from. As an industry, how do we abide by the spirit of the existing regulatory frameworks and try to build a better version of what currently exists, but tailored to this specific asset class.
I think you saw the statements very much reflect the agencies they represent and their own background. So Giancarlo, the CFTC deals with a lot of volatility, and that was one of the things he mentioned. Yes, this is a very, what we see in cryptocurrencies is very volatile, and maybe you don't see that in NASDAQ even in the last week. But we see some very, 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 very high betas and a lot of volatility. So they're kind of used to certain thresholds. And FX is, foreign exchange is a less regulated adventure, I guess, than the stock markets in many ways. For instance, Giancarlo, the commissioner, mentioned, we don't regulate a spot market, and wouldn't for cryptocurrency either. So on the other hand, the commissioner for the SEC, I think he was in private practice before that, mostly dealing with public issue, IPOs, and capital markets and public issuances. When you're trying to sell $1 billion of stock to the public, and these very, very lengthy disclosures that are really the cornerstone of securities laws, like disclosure and investor fairness. So, and coming at it from that attitude. Now, the token sales, they certainly don't look, most of them, like a lot of equity sales. The way that, when Apple wants to sell some more stock or something like that. But a lot of them do look a lot more like securities fraud. And whenever that happens, the SEC is sure to be there. And one thing to recall is that, at least from a lawyer's perspective, I would say that the federal courts do like to agree with the SEC when they're trying to decide what is and isn't a security. And that seems to be the history of it. We can go back to something called whiskey. Well, I'm trying to remember now. It's whiskey warehouse receipts. And this was going back to the 1930s, and I believe in the late 60s. Finally, the SEC actually had a federal court ruling that said that if what you're trying to do is sell the rights to whiskey that's currently being sitting in a warehouse, but later is able to be distributed, that's going to be an investment contract, even though the whiskey is, I guess, today's utility coin. Right? And you have the case in 2000, I'm trying to remember it, but I love it, so I always repeat it, where there was this offshore game company, and what you did is you invested in companies that didn't exist, and they told you that you were investing in companies that didn't exist. Instead of IBM, it'd be IBH or something like that. And lo and behold, the people playing this game were making a lot of money, and they could take their dollars out. And it was amazing, it would pay dividends. And what it was a large Ponzi scheme. In other words, the first people playing the game would get money out. They told their friends put money in. That's where the money was coming out. And so one day everybody went to their PC and there was no more game, right? And the SEC somehow got to these people. And the point is the federal court said, yes, this was securities fraud, even though everybody knew that the companies were getting traded and the securities were not real companies or shares. So to a practitioner like myself, it means really take heed about how the SEC is approaching this and how they are construing it. Whether or not you see particular flaws, it's going to be a long time before we know whether or not federal courts agree with them, and they do tend to agree with them.
So, do you mind if I ask you a question?
Yes.
I was curious, because I'm here in part for an education myself.
I was afraid of that. I was here for an education.
And so I just happened to notice that you said that the ICOs, let's say, over the last 18 months, are functionally different than how Apple would go about issuing equity. Can you walk me through the distinctions? Notwithstanding the fact that it's obviously not through registration, all that process, but really the kind of major pillars of steps in the process. What are the major distinctions?
No, I would say the major distinction between the token sales that we've been seeing, and there's more than 1,000, right? So let's lump them all together. The major distinction is that they're not, that you are not getting equity in the company as we have grown to
So
understand.
it's more of the rights and obligations in connection with the instrument.
It's the people building the team might end up building something that you should be able to use the token with at some point. But the company itself is, or the team itself is its own enterprise. and you're not to expect a dividend or an ownership interest in that. I would say that's the major.
Okay,
Yeah,
no, I appreciate that.
test.
So it's not really the method of the offering, it's more what it is that this instrument represents. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Thank you.
So Ryan, I wanted to key off of something that you had mentioned. You were talking about the existing framework. And so I'm going to ask Scott perhaps the only question he will be comfortable answering tonight, which is when we're talking about the existing framework for doing non-registered offerings, there's probably a lot of people in the audience who, like, they might have heard someone say Reg D once, but they probably don't understand it. Like, could you maybe walk us through some of the simple exemptions here?
Yep, sorry. Yeah, happy to. Just quickly, just kind of take a poll. Who are lawyers in this room? Okay, all right. Entrepreneurs that are not lawyers? Okay. Thanks. I think this could be pretty brief because half the room are attorneys. As I'm sure everyone in this room knows, the threshold question here for the securities law framework is whether or not we're talking about a security. To the extent that we are, under the current framework, the offer and sale of the security and the resale must be registered with the SEC or find an applicable exemption. Most, I believe, DERA produced a report in the last 6 months, 6 to 9 months, where
And what
right.
DERA, Scott?
That's our economists, and they produced a report that kind of delineated between the different exempt offerings and how popular they were, both by, I think, in terms of offerings as well as dollars. And the Reg D 506B, 506, by the way the securities law framework functions, under 4A2 is the exempt offering statute, and the Reg D is a series of rules that provide a safe harbor for adequately satisfying authority to the offering. Reg D has several exemptions in it, one of which being 506B, where an unlimited amount of capital can be raised. However, recognizing that for the blockchain space, ICOs, and the way that ICOs generally are promoted through what we would generally consider to be a general solicitation, issuers could not avail themselves of 506B because... A little louder. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so 506B would not really work under most of the ICO, under many ICOs that have been observed due to the inability to generally solicit. 506C, however, does allow for general solicitation. And the issue there, though, for the ICO community is that likely the sale must be to accredited investors. Recognizing Twitter feeds and such are not huge on the accredited investor standards, I recognize that might cause some people some heartache in this room. In addition, there are a couple of other exempt offerings or crowdfunding offerings that are distinctly different than a normal registered offering track. So Reg CF and Reg A Plus. I don't know if it would be, I don't want to give everybody a law class here. Is that of interest to talk about?
Yeah, very much.
I was not hoping that was All right. So Reg A Plus, Reg A technically. Okay, so this is it's an offering where the issuer must actually register with the SEC, but it's kind of a registration light. So there's forms that need to be provided to the commission for comment, but it's considerably more efficient and just generally a lighter comment undertaking. Now there are 2 tiers under Reg A. The first tier is an issuance or raise of up to 20 million. The second is up to 50 million. There are a couple slight distinctions between those two tracks. I guess the primary comment I would make there is to the extent that an issuer goes under the tier 1 track, they're still subject to state state approval, whereas a tier 2 offering does not require that. The major distinction though for Reg A plus issuance versus a Reg D offering is that you do not need to sell to accredited investors. There are a percentage of income, wealth limitation on how much an investor can invest of their capital. Notwithstanding that point, there are non-accredited investors can participate.
If I can, I'll take a few minutes on this because what I find is that if we do this right, you get to save about 427 hours of trying to understand it later. And it only comes from my own frustration of trying to get my arms around securities law. Historically, it goes like this. 1929, a whole bunch of people lose a lot of money. And in 1933, we said, wait, we've got a new idea, which is if you want to sell your stock to anybody, we want you to disclose a lot of information about your company. And here's the rule. We're not going to tell you what kind of company to have, but you're not allowed to make a material misstatement. That's going to be considered fraud. You're also not going to be allowed to have an omission that makes things materially untrue. That's also going to be securities fraud. And the securities fraud is going to be punishable either by us, the federal government, or by individual people that buy your stock under this fraudulent scheme. And that's the 33 Act. So when a company goes public, what they're doing is they're preparing a statement about their company to anybody that wants to buy the stock, and hopefully not making any material misstatements or material omissions. Now, it came to pass that we realized not everybody can do this. It's a lot of work, and you don't need to do it. You don't need to protect all the people all the time. And so we started making exceptions. And the biggest exception is something that isn't a public offering. And then smart lawyers started going, well, wait a second, this is terrible. We're not really sure when something is or isn't a public offering. And so we started with regulations to make specific exemptions. And one is the one that we're talking about, which is 506B, which is saying, you know what, if you've got accredited investors, people of a certain net worth, you make $200,000 yourself, or you and your husband make $300,000, you've got $1 million in net worth, you know what, you guys can sell to those guys all day long. You still can't lie to them. You still can't make material misstatement. But what you don't have to do is register those securities with the SEC. You don't have to put the document through this arduous thing. You might want to disclose some information about your company for a whole bunch of reasons, but you're going to get an exemption. So there's other exemptions. One which was kind of a backwater exemption. I shouldn't say that because probably it's old people, but it wasn't used much. It was Reg A, and the reason was because you couldn't raise them. What it was, it used to be like 2 million and 5 million thresholds. So it was a lot of work and not a lot. That's been raised. What he's talking about now to 20 million and 50 million, and you can do that once every 12 months. It's not quite like an IPO. It's kind of like an IPO, like you do a lot of the same work in terms of preparing a circular. You have to give it to the SEC. They have to approve it, but you get to do a lot of great things about actually offering the securities as long as you do some reporting and as long as you do some disclosures at regular times. That is my one-minute version of it.
Has anyone been approved?
No one, to my knowledge, has been approved on a Reg A plus for tokens. But we have secret information from the I'm sorry.
I really appreciate the history that you just provided. That was really helpful. And I kind of want to emphasize something. I think this is just echoing what the chair said to the Senate this morning. This is a disclosure-based framework. So it's not a merit-based. So the commission's not making a determination of whether or not it's a good business model or good idea or good type of transaction. It is simply a function of ensuring or attempting to ensure that anyone that's going to be buying into buying the security has the requisite amount of information that is accurate and complete, and so they can make an informed decision. And that's first and foremost the kind of the point underlying this. And frankly, that's not entirely dissimilar from a lot of the observations made among the ICO community, where a lot of values that are espoused are in connection with thorough white papers, a summary of the token or its attributes, use of the proceeds, a little bit about the business model and or the tech itself and the team putting together. That's not a far departure from the things that we're talking about that already exist in our securities law framework.
And we're not even going that far, right? What we're trying to do for 1.0 is just get the equivalent to the front page of the 10K. Supply authorized and outstanding would be a hell of a place to start. Because you don't actually know what the inflation is for 90% of the tokens out there. There's hidden inflation in the form of vesting schedules, and advisors and investors and early employees have different schedules, or maybe no schedules at all. People just don't understand the hidden inflation is kind of locked in the long tail of these tokens that's going to hit the market over the course of the next 12 months. And I pick on a couple of different projects that are actually, I think, doing things the right way and generally on the up and up. Just to illustrate the point. But Civic, for instance, I think ran a very democratic, smart, best efforts token sale last summer. But I don't think a lot of people recognize that after the first calendar year, a third of their treasury tokens, which is about 11% of the fully diluted supply, become liquid. What happens when they want to sell that, right? What do they have to disclose it to the token community? Do they do a filing with the SEC? No, because it's not a security. How do people actually know when that supply becomes liquid? Because it's not just 11%, 11 points out of the fully diluted supply. It's going to actually be more like potentially 25, 30% inflation overnight if they wanted to dump it. And then he will tell you, well, don't be silly. We wouldn't do that. It would crash the price. It would destroy the community. But the point is they could, right? And there's really no way to tell when something like that could happen. And he's one of the good guys in the industry. I like Civic, I like Vinny, and I think he's a reputable guy. There are a lot of others in the industry that I'd not say the same for. So in a sentiment-driven market where there are no such things as fundamentals, maybe the next best thing that we can get that's actually going to be material that we can use to self-regulate a little bit is just knowing what liquid supply is and when new liquid supply becomes outstanding and part of the float. That's we're talking about things that are so rudimentary that for us, when we think about self-regulation, that they're so non-controversial that anyone that would basically say, well, we're not going to disclose that, would raise some serious red flags. And I think that's going to be our best chance at getting ahead of this before regulation comes from on high. Is starting non-controversial, objective, easy to verify, relatively static information, and things that really shouldn't be that hard to get, but just aren't available anywhere today.
I think that's right. In the hearing today, there was bipartisan concern, and you hardly see them agreeing, and they want to actually fund the agencies to kind of fight cryptocurrency is the message that I got. So I do think regulation is going to come down. The only person that I think spoke against kind of just a disclosure-based regime was Representative Kennedy. But other than that, I heard no support, outside of that. So the more we can self-regulate and think about ways that we can show, there's transparency in this market and there is information out there, I think the better.
Was Kennedy the one who asked Chairman Clayton if you read the disclosures the last time he purchased?
He asked Giancarlo that.
He asked Giancarlo that. Okay, yeah. If you didn't catch it, one of the members of the committee asked the head of the CFTC what was the last security that he bought, and he said it was a mutual fund. And he asked him, did he receive the disclosure? And you could see him just kind of be like, yes, I know where this is going. And the person asked, and did you read the entire thing? And he was like, no, I didn't. And that led to a whole discussion about.
Does it matter?
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Well, and I think that kind of illustrates the point, right? No one reads the 10K. No one reads, if they read the 10K, they certainly don't look at the risk factors because it's just a million risk factors of legalese. Basically a comet could fall from the sky and kill everybody in the office, and so that's a risk. And I think because there's no prioritization of what is actually material and what is a likely risk, and there's no scoring because it's just something that's old and stodgy and kind of top down, I don't think you're going to get much innovation from the SEC or any equivalent regulator internationally. More of this that we can do that's kind of by the spirit and within the spirit and guidelines that are already in existence, I would argue that the industry should be able to do a better job And I think the top projects generally have ethos of transparency and a willingness to bring a lot of this to the fore and ultimately compete long-term on the viability of the tech that they're building. Let's let the cream rise to the top.
Yeah, and so like one of the reasons why I wanted to go over some fairly dry subject matter is that, I've spoken with a lot of people who are interested in blockchain products, and a lot of people don't know that these exemptions exist. Like they only see two paths. One is let's just sell it, and the other is let's go to Switzerland and make a Swiss foundation, or let's go offshore someplace and maybe that will work out for us. But so really, kind of explaining to people that no, there are these other ways to do it. A lot of people, aren't even aware of that. So one question that I wanted to, topic to have you lead it on is, in a hypothetical world where the SEC or CFTC did want to have some new rules, how would that go about happening? Would you need congressional action to do that? Could one of the agencies do it by themselves? I think people know very little about how rulemaking takes place, and you happen to have some experience in that?
Yeah. So, if you watched the hearing today, they talked a lot about, do you CFTC and do you SEC have enough jurisdiction? Do you have enough authority? Because there is authority there to act in this space. And you've seen that like with the 21A report, right? The commission decided that this particular offering was a security, and then they just, applied all the rules around securities to that because they already had jurisdiction there. They, under the 33 and 34 Act, there's a little bit of room for them to make rules and regulations. There's some exemptive authority, so they can certainly act in this space if they want to. I don't foresee them doing that. The SEC as an independent agency can't go to Congress and lobby for anything. What they can do, though, is ask, is answer questions. So what typically happens is someone will have an idea for a bill, so potentially Senator Crapo, because he kept asking about this jurisdiction piece. So what the staff of Senator Crapo will call up the SEC and say, can you help us? Because they're not securities experts. They don't know what their bill is going to do to the markets. And the Securities and Exchange Commission staff will advise, well, this is what we think about investor protection, this is what we think about capital markets, and help them formulate that type of language that makes sense. So there's a lot of input that the commission gives, to the Hill, but the Hill, eventually will pass legislation that they think is appropriate, despite whatever the commission thinks. So I think the take home, for me anyway, is the more that people want to create relationships, both with your congressional members, but certainly with the staff of the agencies, the better off you're going to be, because then you're going to be heard and they're really going to understand what concerns you and what shouldn't concern them.
All right, what is the engagement with private sector folks that are outside of the DC regime when it comes to rulemaking? Consultants, lobbyists?
I've never seen any, so I worked in a rulemaking division for a couple of years, and I've never seen any meeting request be turned down, even by the heads of the rulemaking. They want to hear, it's just people, I think, feel like they won't be heard. Also, when there is a notice out there for a rulemaking, you get an opportunity to comment, and I think you really should consider commenting, because every single comment that is made has to be addressed in writing by the SEC. In some way, so you at least know that you've been heard.
So I think out of everyone up here, Adam, you've probably got the most contact with people sort of actually engaged in the process of starting these companies. No?
Well, and they tell him everything. They tell me half of it.
Well,
So I said they tell him at Ryan everything. They tell me half of it.
you have smart clients, so. No, so I was just wondering, if what's really front of mind to you, or if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing or get clarity on one thing, what's your really top of mind issue in this space?
And we were talking about it before the panel. The question becomes, so the idea here is that because the way the token sale is promoted, that it puts into the minds of the buyers the idea that they're an investor and they're buying the token for a profit. That profit's going to come from the efforts of the team. And that's what satisfies what's called the Howey test. That makes it an investment contract, and all investment contracts are securities. And that brings it under the jurisdiction of the SEC. okay. At some point, a lot of tokens are intended as software. In some cases, they're sort of a payment software, right? They're a lot like a vending machine token that you put in and you get to hear your favorite song. I would say that the vast majority of token sales have those kinds of utility type. Some are intended more like the analogy I give is if it's 1960 and IBM was creating a new mainframe. And they said, you know what, instead of trying to get the money for this new mainframe out of profits or regular investors, we're going to sell punch cards that's going to work on this mainframe. We're going to sell 1 billion punch cards for 10 cents each. And then anybody who buys them will be able to use it on our new mainframe, which we've financed to this very creative 1960s hypothetical. At some point, even if we consider that the sale of those punch cards is an investment contract, at some point, those punch cards become just punch cards and are no longer securities. And that becomes a very interesting question. And trying to plan a token sale, even one under Reg A+, or even one under a Reg D exemption, the question becomes, when is it that software is going to become just software again? Just like the whiskey barrels that were in the warehouse, even though you had a right to buy that whiskey, at some point it becomes regular whiskey that I suppose has the utility of drinking, right? And I'd say, we're going to all be dealing with this week and next month. That's probably top of mind. I'd love to. We're very interested in regulatory change. We're very curious about, federal preemption of different kinds. The idea of most exchanges that are dealing only in crypto are regulated under as a money services business federally. And then, unfortunately, under 49 states and I guess a couple of territories, under the money transmitter rules of those states, if they have them, and if they apply. This is unlike any other country in the world, that amount of difficulty. And, you might be fine in this state and not this one, and you've got a whole bunch of states to consider. So they were talking during the hearings about an idea of federal preemption, which was actually also considered by comptroller of currency, which can create a new kind of bank. That's kind of debated about whether they can and can't. It's being litigated. Because I think most people see that, and it's not just cryptocurrency, it's payments in general, it's FinTech as a broad sector. There are, there's been a number of clients that outside of crypto, that I've taken them to the airport. Because in Europe they have a different regulatory scheme that's easy, more predictable, and less expensive to comply with. And that's, to me, the most awful. It reminds me of in the mid-90s. It was different. I represented the largest firewall company in the United States, and they couldn't compete with Europeans and people outside the United States because they weren't allowed to export strong cryptography. It was considered a munition. It was on the munitions list. Until that was changed after a lot of effort. It looked like we were going to be the runners-up. And I just don't want to see that happen with FinTech in the United States. I'd love, if I had a real magic wand, I'd love to see a comprehensive idea about how to make that wall-making the states happy. I don't have a lot of hope for it.
That's what I would imagine. So let's throw it open to audience questions. Do we have a roving mic? Yes? No? No?
Nope, just
No, all right.
Stand up.
Go ahead.
Okay, so there's an 800-pound gorilla question that you guys haven't talked about, which is secondary trading. So let me create a dilemma. I can see someone nodding. And I'll be talking to my friend Mr. Redfern in a couple of weeks about it because this is a big deal. But the issue is that there are many exchanges, and I would usually do air quotes on them because they're not really exchanges, that trade crypto. They're actually quite far from exchanges, both in terms of not being broker-dealers, ATSs, and certainly not exchanges with everything that that implies. But they trade hundreds, if not the full 1,000 ICOs, and investors can get liquidity. If you choose to do a Reg A+ offering or a Reg D offering, there is no liquidity. You can't list them on any of those exchanges. Now, obviously that's one part of the dilemma. The other part of the dilemma is if the SEC does rule, as was suggested on Twitter today, and I think you were on this thread, Ryan, that Ethereum is a security based on Vitalik Buterin's importance, et cetera, the fact that it was an ICO, and all of these things are securities, then arguably all the investors in cryptocurrencies, with the exception of pure Bitcoin, their liquidity goes poof. Now, I would like to think the SEC won't do that, but I can't see a way forward without exemptive relief or rulemaking. Can anybody on the panel?
You two are definitely the back of that one. No way.
There you go.
That's a good
Yeah, I don't know why you were so eager to pass me the mic. I'm not nearly as knowledgeable, I'm sure, as these other three on this particular topic, but I will say there are definitely exchanges that are now coming out. Templum in New York as an ATS, Polymath in Canada, I'm not sure quite what the regulatory positioning is, T0, right? Those are coming, right? And I think the next milestone will be what's the first successful Reg A Plus offering. In terms of secondary trading, I kind of feel like it's an existential type of risk for that whole market because of how quickly everything could freeze overnight. So I agree. And basically, my co-founder and I, we just started this company, but we've been banging the drum basically since the November comments from Clayton saying these all have the hallmarks of a security, saying we have a very short window to get ahead of this before the SEC just comes in and says enough's enough. Too many people have lost money, or we've seen too many examples of fraud, and they just, instead of taking a facts and circumstances approach, as they have been, just clamp down on the choke points, which are these unregulated exchanges, to your point. So there's a silver lining there, which I think that fear that's in the back of everybody's mind has made even the most libertarian crypto anarchist very, very eager to engage and think about what self-regulation would look like versus the alternative, which will absolutely be much worse.
No, I'm just wondering if it's all been said. You have Templum, you have people realizing, they look at the volumes of GDAX, of Kraken, and what have you, or of Binance, and they holy cow. And they go, boy, I'd actually love to make hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and if it is going to be regulated in the United States that way, more. Well, I didn't mean collectively or individually. As a new entrant, when you're trying to pitch to your investors, so you see that emphasis. There will be overseas exchange, that whether or not they're reaching out to American traders or not, they'll probably be there. The problem with that is, that's one of the rushes that we always have in regulation. You want to do it right, so that there's not a race to the bottom by consumers. And I'd say the real interesting sideboard holding is distributed exchanges, right? I'm sorry, not distributed, decentralized exchanges, where, we're seeing models for this. They're going to happen. They have happened, and I think it's going to continue. How much legitimacy and how much uptake, it will be interesting. It will be long and short of it.
Then the next choke point becomes the funds.
Yeah.
So, the next liquidity source that you'd cut off would be the polychains of the world and the Drapers of the world and all these funds that have invested in many cases with sizable discounts and pre-sales in exchange for lockups. Those are the dynamics that certainly
Which, by the way, Reg A Plus, non-discriminatory pricing says.
Yeah, exactly. So,
All right, more questions?
So, disclosure, I'm probably the only person in the room that has actually run a Reg D token offering at this point. But I'm also we are one of the most active investors in the space and have a vested interest in structuring investments for our portfolio companies as well as those we're doing at arm's length in a way that is compliant. right? We actually went through the difficulty of doing a Reg D and Reg S offering with no liquidity, as was correctly pointed out. So my question is, from a best practices standpoint, and given the way the market has evolved over the last 60 days or so, where previously it was nearly 100% of the dollars and volume was raised in the public sale, to an environment where nearly all, if not all, of the dollars are raised in a private pre-sale to accredited investors only, where SAFs or a future token agreement of some type is being used, which is clearly a security. When that security is extinguished by the delivery of the functional utility tokens, assuming for the sake of argument that there are two aspects to a utility token offering, the structure of the utility token itself and the structure of the sale. So assuming the sale is conducted in such a way that the utility token is in fact a utility token, it is not poisoned, for lack of a better word, by the mechanism of the sale itself, how does the panel, particularly the gentleman in the middle, view the use of securities instruments under existing regulations, which are then extinguished by the delivery of a functional utility token, which is then available potentially on exchanges or through other marketing means from the qualified or accredited investors who participated in the investment activity originally?
I do not feel bad for the legal gymnastics we have to do.
By the way, Greg asks me these questions every week.
I do. You're not the first one I've asked this. You're just the most potentially qualified.
It's an outstanding question. I can't answer it.
But you have an opinion on it.
Well, I'd love to hear your.
Look, in short, there are those of us who are really looking for best practices and are trying to figure out what they are, because we have reputation and the funds of others that we are investing, and we're looking to do things correctly. We don't have a lot of guidance what that looks like, and we're trying to find best paths forward. And the best path does not necessarily look like just don't be the worst, so you're not, munchy or whatever else. Like we were trying to do it right.
Yeah, I mean, I know this is one of the issues that's debated between the South White Paper and the rebuttal to the South critique. Just unfortunately, it's a good question.
It's a great question.
You could be one of our.
So if there was ever a question pretty much designed to elicit a no comment, that was it.
Or just discussion,
Always respond, Dave, just so it's not just dead space.
Ultimately, what we've gotten across in the Munchie order, and I write Munchie order. I mean, I have to say this about the SEC's. I'll just group them into a collective called the public documents. Whether it's the Dow investigative report or the Munchie order from December 11th, really well written. Like really well. You want a good, tight, well-written summary of securities laws and application. They're really well done. And we have a lot of regulatory bodies, and I read many, and they're really probably the most readable ones out there. But what they're looking for ultimately is that the buyer at some stage is not buying with the expectation of profits due to the efforts of the team. And I think that's where we're going to be making some educated guesses. Some people are going to take some aggressive positions. Some people are going to many people are going to kill their overall efforts, unfortunately, because they don't know where to draw the line. And that's sad, because I think when you look at Ethereum, I mean, the neat thing about Ethereum was, and is, it's this great way to get a whole bunch of people involved on a brand new open source technology that if it was, Linux was an amazing contribution to computer science and industry, but it took a lot of people, a lot of free hours to get it together. And so created this new model for, in a collective way, creating something that, even if it ends up not being the smart contract platform that rules the day, bringing out some really innovative ideas, bringing out a lot of attention, having large enterprises rethink the fundamental nature of how they do things and how they connect. And I just hate to think that so many good projects might be killed because we're not sure where to draw the line. But that's going to happen. And ultimately, we're going to be asking ourselves as legal analytics, when can I sell this more like a piece of Intuit software at Fry's, and less like a promise that I'm going to deliver something with my team so that you can make a profit off of it if we're successful.
Who in here has bought a token? Who in here has bought a token for consumptive use? More than I would have expected.
Let's do one more question to whoever has the mic.
Hi. So the first question was, can a Reg security be liquid on the secondary market? The second question is basically, can a security token becomes a utility token through becomes a utility when the software exists? So now my question is, if we take a utility token, so really a software which exists, you took the example of a punch card. So let's say the punch card on the market, the IBM server has reached the market. Can we put this punch card in a secondary market and even put a cap on the number of punch cards without converting them into security?
That's a great question. So your question was what we've been trying to answer really, is at what point does it just become a punch card again? At the moment that it does become just a punch card again, then you don't need a specific regulated exchange or secondary market in order to trade it. It becomes like a BBS for baseball cards, right? The same sort of principles would apply. Your first question was whether or not if there's a Reg A plus.
I was just recap.
Oh, okay, so I think we're pretty much out of time for this panel. So if you could please thank